For the first time in at least 48 years, this historic gem of a ship had entered a dry dock. But the sad, twisted irony was that instead of renewing her life, this concrete and steel basin would be her tomb. Beauty is, of course, in the eye of the beholder, but for those of us who love classic ships, the Aurora's sculpted form was a masterpiece of design. Her fine lines, gracious curves, and elegant symmetry were a lost shipbuilder's art. She came from an era when ships not only served a function, but were meant to inspire with their beauty and power. How and why did she get here? Well, let's turn back the clock almost exactly 70 years to reflect upon the 9 lives of the Aurora. In early February of 1955, hull number 786 loomed over the slipway at the Steinwerder Industry shipyard, now known as Blohm & Voss, in Hamburg. What distinguished this little beauty from other ships was that she was the first built in Germany for German owners since World War II. Named for an armed sailing ship built in 1669, the Wappen von Hamburg, or Coat of Arms of Hamburg, was launched on February 1, 1955. She was completed in early May for HADOG, the Hauptdampfschifffahrt, which is a Hamburg-based local public transport company. The liner, like Wappen von Hamburg, would offer daily cruise service from the Landungsbrücken in the heart of Hamburg, up the Elbe River to Cuxhaven, then onwards to Helgoland, a small but strategic island in the North Sea. She was, of course, solidly built and beautifully appointed in traditional mid-century European style, with finely crafted woods, elegant furnishings, specially commissioned artworks, and yes, acres of polished linoleum decking. Since she was a day cruise ship, there were no cabins, so her passenger decks were fully devoted to public spaces, including 3 large lounges, a pair of galleries with picture windows, and a proper dining room. The 2,500 gross ton ship carried 1,600 passengers who were looked after by a crew of 38, plus another 32 catering personnel. Her bridge deck featured open wings and a terrace in front of the wheelhouse, which was fitted with a large modern console. Boat deck began with a large open forward terrace and open promenades that continued to an even larger aft terrace. There was a lovely observation lounge on this level with picture windows and a carved wooden panel depicting geese in flight. Farther aft, there was a handsomely paneled grand staircase with a portrait of the Wappen von Hamburg's namesake leading down to upper deck. Upper deck began at the forecastle with a large crane and cargo gear, continuing aft with a series of public spaces to the fantail. Upper deck began with a lounge that could seat up to 132, followed by 66 passenger verandas with picture windows on either side, leading to the ballroom and smoking room with combined seating for 135. The ballroom's layout and even some of its cocktail tables would remain unchanged for decades. This was the ship's most popular hub and featured live music. Second deck began with crew accommodations that were followed by public lavatories leading to the dining room. Backed with a large marquetry panel of musicians, the dining room could seat 100 passengers and was an especially handsome space. The forward portion of main deck had officers' accommodations, and aft of the engine compartment there were crew and engineers' accommodations. Lower deck was dedicated to hold space and the engine room. The diesel-electric Wappen von Hamburg was fitted with 5 12-cylinder, 1,200 horsepower Maybach diesels that drove twin screws at a service speed of 18 knots. Maybach built the diesels that powered the German Zeppelin airships and the Nazi tanks in World War II. It was purchased by Mercedes-Benz in 1960. And the tank tops were, of course, the very bottom level of the ship. The Wappen von Hamburg was completed in early May and exceeded all expectations on her sea trials. Nicknamed the Seaside Resort Ship, or Seebadderschiff, her schedule was precisely timed, and passengers had the option of overnighting at hotels in Cuxhaven or Helgoland and returning the following day. The Wappen von Hamburg was extremely successful, and in almost every image of her she shone with her decks literally teeming with humanity, even while plunging into a turbulent North Sea. But then I suppose in those conditions, and with 1,600 fellow guests to share the ship with, there was no better option than getting some fresh sea air. After a 4.5-hour journey from Hamburg, she would anchor off Helgoland for 5.5 hours. All in all, this was a relatively short time considering passengers had to tender to and from the ship. And then there was another 4.5 hours return voyage. Taking a train to and from Cuxhaven saved some time, but sooner owners would go back to the drawing board for a larger, faster ship. In the meantime, in 1956, she was joined by her almost twin, the Bunte Kuh, or colorful cow. The Bunte Kuh lacked the open terrace in front of the bridge and had a smaller funnel, otherwise she was nearly identical. For a while, her career even took a similar trajectory. In 1962, she was sold to Sunlines and became the first Stella Solaris, a top-rated cruise ship. Then in 1971, she became the private yacht Layup of the Sheikh of Qatar and was presumed scrapped decades ago. In 1960, with her larger, faster replacement on order, the Wappen von Hamburg returned to her builders for a complete transformation into the deluxe cruise ship DELOS for Nomikos Lines, a Greek family-owned company that was one of the pioneers of modern Aegean cruising. For her new role and second life, the ship was fitted out with full air conditioning, a small pool, and cabins, all with private facilities to accommodate 186 passengers. The small pool replaced the crane on the foredeck, and the cabins replaced the forward lounge, the verandas, and the forward crew accommodations. Each summer, DELOS offered 3-night cruises from Piraeus to Delos, Mykonos, and Rhodes. She would also offer 4-night cruises that added Heraklion and Santorini, and like today, you could combine both itineraries. Brochures from the time touted the DELOS's modern amenities and pool, which by today's standards would be the size of a small whirlpool. Not to mention its unsheltered location made it impractical except in port when most passengers were ashore. But at least now she had a pool and spacious deck areas that were ideal for scenic cruising. The DELOS lounge had physically changed little from the Wappen von Hamburg's ballroom and smoking room, although it appears the entertainment had evolved from papa sing-alongs and jazz to festive Greek bouzouki folkloric song and dance. There was an inviting semicircular bar in the aft starboard corner, and the reception lobby featured a mural of Poseidon riding atop a pair of mythical sea serpents. There was a purser's desk on main deck, and boutique showcases lined the elegantly curved aft stair tower. Aside from new soft fittings and smaller chairs, the dining room retained its layout and that nice musician's marquetry panel, but the food, of course, had a decidedly more Mediterranean flair. Those cabins with large picture windows that replaced the upper deck public spaces were quite the rage in those pre-veranda days, with and without the Twiggy-esque model. And speaking of that poor model, this brochure image has to be one of the creepiest ever published. DELOS was a perfect ship for her time. and her small size gave her access to the Aegean's most inviting ports long before the overwhelming megaships of today. In 1962, she had her first brush with cultural relevance when her image was used to represent the Spectre Yacht in From Russia with Love, although the onboard scenes were filmed on a studio soundstage. DELOS soon became a victim of her own success. Rival companies like Sunline, Zapiratiki, and Cavanides began introducing larger, more fancy ships. In 1967, Chuck West, the owner of Seattle-based West Tours, took a cruise on the DELOS with his wife. They fell in love with the ship, purchased her for $2.5 million, and spent another $1 million converting her into their flagship, the Polar Star. Her third life had just begun. The Polar Star was a perfect size for the burgeoning Alaska cruise market, where West Tours was a major player. The ship could navigate narrow fjords, and her sturdy hull was built for icy seas. Her forward observation deck and that large afterdeck were ideal for viewing the majestic scenery of Alaska and Canada. Her layout was unchanged, but the observation lounge became a card room, and the ballroom was given updated furniture, artwork, and soft fittings with lots of beads. It was 1967 after all. The musicians' panel in the dining room now loomed behind a sea of orange and black furnishings and some seriously mod light fixtures that would be in high demand with fellow modernism fans. Those A-deck cabins with picture windows were the most appealing, although there was a cozy charm to the B-deck cabins with windows or twin portholes. However, those interior C-deck cabins weren't illustrated in the brochures. In the winter of 1969, the Polar Star sailed off to the Caribbean before returning to Alaska in 1970. Around this time, a young statuesque hostess named Jeraldine Saunders joined the ship and later wrote about it in her book, The Love Boats, which inspired the hit TV series and the ship's second brush with pop cultural relevance. This happened just as the ship transitioned into her fourth life, becoming the Pacific Star. Basically, only her name changed as she embarked on a new program of 7-night cruises from Tahiti. Although her name was more suited for warm weather cruising, the Pacific Star soon returned to Alaska cruises, but that market was now growing once again with newer, larger, and fancier ships. Meanwhile, new brochure images showed her unchanged interiors being enjoyed by a different cast of models. Once again a victim of her own success, Pacific Star was sold to new owners to embark on a new life, her fifth, with an exotic new name and look as the Xanadu. In 1972, Donald L. Ferguson Cruises issued a deluxe embossed advance brochure promoting the Xanadu as a special cruise ship for travelers. Using the line "In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure-dome decree," taken from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan, based on the adventures of Marco Polo. In the ship's transition to Xanadu, the A, B, and C decks were renamed Angkor, Bokhara, and Cathay, and the public spaces were given Asiatic names as well. This is a photo of the interior designer taken by crew member Stephen Young. Young was on board during the refit and actually rescued some of the original fittings that were replaced with the new decor. The ship was now adorned with Asian antiques from the owner's wife's private collection. The old card room was divided into the smaller Kanabalu card room and the library of the Kubla Khan. A backlit ancient Chinese motif presided over the reception hall, and the aft stairs now boasted a metal Buddha panel and a trellis with enameled lotus blossoms. Plush carpeting and more Asiatic motifs graced the lower level at the entrance to the dining room. In lieu of the music panel, the now Balishan dining room backdrop was an ancient Chinese palace. As the Marco Polo lounge, the former ballroom had black rattan chairs, and those original surviving tables were painted black. and the original woodwork in the staterooms was now covered in shades of pale paint. The Xanadu continued sailing to Alaska each summer, offering 7-night cruises from Vancouver through the Inside Passage to Ketchikan, Tracy Arm, Juneau, Skagway, Haines, and Prince Rupert. Crew member Young recalled the ship being ideal for that sheltered route and also worked aboard during one of her more exotic cruises to Mexico, Central America, and the Galapagos. There, Young recalled that guests were taken out for wildlife spotting excursions aboard the 2 new air-conditioned tenders that were added in the Xanadu refit. Stephen was kind enough to provide some rare images of them in use and even a few shots on deck during Xanadu's days in the open seas, where she tended to feel the motion of the ocean and where fellow seasick crew members would retreat to the fantail to weather it out. Fortunately, there were some balmy days as well. After her 1975 Alaska season, Xanadu headed back down the west coast to offer a season of Mexican Riviera cruises from Los Angeles and San Diego. This is where I had my first encounter with the ship, having persuaded my father to drive me down to the port of Los Angeles to spend an afternoon on board at some remote pier in Wilmington, armed with my lousy pocket Instamatic camera. At the time, there was quite a bit of buzz about her being a small luxury expedition ship. I recall her being quite spotless and loved her classic lines and those beautifully maintained teak decks. Her pool was hidden under a hatch cover, and the telegraphs on her bridge panel were impeccably polished. I even snuck out to the aft part of bridge deck for a view of the deck chairs under that canopy on her stern. Her lovely promenades were still in great condition, and that canopy terrace looked ideal for catching up on a good read. Rather crudely, I captured the library of Kubla Khan, the Marco Polo lounge, the lobby, and the dining room, which had a curious cage-like fixture in the middle. I would learn later that the ship's owners were having financial issues, and that after her next Alaska season, the Xanadu's charmed life was nearing its end. In 1977, the ship was laid up, her interiors were auctioned off, and she was eventually taken to Alaska to house cannery workers at a fish factory before being laid up at Tacoma. In 1984, she was sold to new owners who renamed her X-Pex for intended use as an exhibition ship. En route to Los Angeles, she broke down off Coos Bay and had to be towed to a Long Beach anchorage, where she sat for years with a corrugated metal structure on her stern. Aside from the addition of that structure, she'd never served that purpose, and this is where I next saw the ship in 1989, looking forlorn and forgotten, but still quite striking with her dashing, curvaceous lines. Thankfully, I would see her again. In 1991, she was bought by Wilmington, California-based Friendships, renamed Faithful, and painted deep blue with a red racing stripe for intended use as a Christian missionary relief ship. My friend and I hired a local boat in 1994 and got drenched filming her at an anchorage in outer Los Angeles harbor. The Faithful was eventually moved to a remote berth in San Pedro Harbor, where my inquiries to visit were either ignored, deferred, or declined. I was told the ship was being converted for relief duties in Central America, and there did appear to be some superficial work in the beginning. Part of that included the cabins on forward A deck being removed so that they could create a chapel or theater. In late 1994, her mainmast was still there, along with part of that structure on her stern. But by early 1996, both structures were gone, and there seemed to be something going on in the dining room. As a journalist and historian who was traveling around the world to document ships, I kept asking for a visit and kept getting turned down. When I approached the ship, the curtains were always drawn, piquing my curiosity even more. It was actually quite obvious that people were living on board, but aside from that, the ship just sat there and began to fade in the elements. At one point, a Cyrillic name had been printed on her bow, presumably as a backdrop on a TV or movie set. Well, I would soon find out why I was never allowed to visit the ship. Shortly after this was shot, she was arrested by the Coast Guard for illegally housing Christian refugees. After that, she was supposedly sold to a Florida-based doctor and moved to Terminal Island, where I was finally granted a visit.
Yep, this camera's good.
Upon boarding, her live-aboard watchman showed me some of the ship's old plans and manuals, and in the space originally a lounge converted to cabins for DELOS and then gutted by friendships, I found some of the discarded ballroom tables that the watchman was happy to sell to me. After the visit, I had to take him to my local bank ready teller, as he would only take cash. But I'm really glad I did, as these are among the very few original items to survive the ship.
Facing forward.
The cabins I visited had definitely looked lived in and perhaps quickly abandoned by their occupants, with discarded clothes and other items strewn everywhere. This somewhat sad scenario was a far cry from the chic boutique luxury cruise ship I had last visited some 27 years prior. Nonetheless, I was happy to have made the visit, assuming it would be my last. Thankfully, fate would eventually prove that assumption wrong. If you look beyond the piles of garbage, cheap wallpaper, and Home Depot-style fittings, the layout and basics of the ship were still charming, especially in the eyes of a vintage ship aficionado. The former ballroom had been stripped back to just the basics, save for a relief map of the world hovering above the still original remnants of the dance floor. On forward prom deck, the carpeting and bulkhead dividing the Cannibaaloo card room from the library had been removed, revealing the original linoleum decking and that carved bird panel from the Wappen von Hamburg era. Even then, some of its Asiatic Xanadu ceiling lights survived. In so many areas, if you just looked past the debris and cheap fittings, there were potentially elegant spaces. Down on B deck, some of the cabins looked unchanged from the Polar Star era. While perhaps a bit cozy for a week-long cruise, it was hard to think of these spaces being used to house people for significant amounts of time.
Port side.
With our flashlights, we explored some of the B-deck crew spaces, then headed back up to the stripped-out bridge, where the brass gauges and panels had been removed. Just aft to the bridge, we found the disused radio and chart rooms.
This one.
Our exploration of the outer decks began on the flying bridge, which had been bleached by decades of sun and rain. Up close, her towering radio mast was like a finely crafted and streamlined sculpture. And as those wind gusts whipped at my cameras, the same could be said of her weathered but beautifully curved superstructure and foredecks. Although the ship had seen far better days, I was, after over a decade of trying, so glad to have visited her again. In early 2004, she was at the same berth, but by 2005 she had moved and had been sold to new owners, Al Barak Aviation, who announced that she was to be rebuilt into a private yacht called Xanadu 2. That September, I watched as preparations were made for towing her to Alameda, a risky trek up the notoriously rough California coast that she seemed to handle well. Once in Alameda, however, nothing seemed to be happening with her conversion. The would-be Xanadu II had been abandoned and was soon occupied by addicts and homeless people. The ship was once again down on her luck and became the scourge of the city of Alameda, who wanted her out of there. In 2008, they quietly hired a local salvager named Kurt Lind, who towed her off to the Sacramento Delta with the intention of scrapping her. Lind changed his mind and put the ship up for sale on Craigslist, where she eventually found a buyer in tech entrepreneur Chris Willson. He brought the ship to Rio Vista and began restoring her. In 2009, the History Channel reached out to me seeking a dilapidated ship they could feature on their Life After People show to illustrate a decaying and neglected ship. I contacted Chris Willson, who welcomed me on board, but to the History Channel's chagrin, he had cleaned up her interior significantly since my last visit. So pretty much all the footage they used was external. And while I understand why the History Channel people were disappointed, I was so happy the ship had found someone who wanted to bring her back from the brink of destruction.
This looks great.
Spaces like the lounge looked hopeful and welcoming once more, and soon that rust-streaked and faded exterior would follow suit. At one point, as he was restoring the ship, Chris mentioned witnessing a beautiful sunrise from the ship's decks, leading to her next name and ninth life as the Aurora. That new coat of glistening white paint on her hull and the deep blue once again on her funnel were nothing short of inspirational when I returned for a visit the following May. Chris's work throughout the ship brought back a luster and a positive vibe I hadn't seen or felt since 1976. But even then, plans were underway to find a new home for the Aurora. I would make a quick return to the ship on July 31st, settling into one of her A-deck cabins and marveling at the Wi-Fi, which was better than most cruise ships at the time. The 1936-built tug Robert Gray was alongside, preparing to tow Aurora to Pier 38 on the San Francisco waterfront. In the early morning hours, the tow was well underway. Behind the ship, there was a beautiful sunrise, which was quite fitting with her being named after the Roman goddess of the dawn, and with all the hope of her embarking on a new life after all the years of neglect. With many thanks to Chris for inviting me to document Aurora's passage, I got to experience being on board as water flowed beneath her keel. Although her engines were silent, Aurora felt alive, and I was literally living out a dream. Mount Diablo loomed on her port side, and soon we passed the U.S. Reserve Fleet in Suisun Bay on her starboard side. The Benicia Martinez Bridge was the first major span we would go under on this scenic and historic transit. From the wind-whipped flying bridge to promenade deck and even her fantail, I took it all in. Assisting the tow on the port side was an LCM-8 U.S. Navy landing craft. As Aurora approached the Carquinez Bridge at the entrance to San Francisco Bay, I took in the views from the Robert Gray. The late Kurt Lind, who actually towed Aurora away from Alameda, was at the Robert Gray's helm. I would actually switch between the two ships for the rest of the short voyage. In the slightly rougher bay waters, there was a slight bone in the teeth of Aurora's prow, and if there ever was a good time to scale her mast, this was it. Frankly, there were no bad views that day, just good and better ones. Yeah, I know I'm a little crazy for loving that camelback cantilever span of the Richmond Bridge, but I had to be on Aurora's forecastle as she passed underneath. Sorry about this slight camera jiggle, but the wind was pretty fierce as the Richmond shadow and then a well-timed gull passed over us. I would only have a few more moments to experience Aurora in motion before getting yet another rare opportunity, with thanks again to Chris Willson, to capture this event from yet another perspective, that of a speeding Zodiac in the bay. As we pulled away, there was just a small patch of the Faithful's blue paint left on Aurora's stern. The rest of the ship literally sparkled in the afternoon sun, dwarfing the hard-working 127-foot Robert Gray. By the way, the Robert Gray has gone on to a new life as the charter yacht Sacagawea. The view just got better and better as we forged ahead. This was Aurora at her sleekest and most beautiful. Her yacht-like lines were perfection. It was so worth getting drenched a second time for this pearl of a ship. The Zodiac then whisked me off to Pier 38, where I was able to take in Aurora's approach and her passage under the last bridge of the day, the Bay Bridge. The tow had slowed significantly as the fog encroached and the sun set, so the goddess of the dawn finally reached her berth on the twilight of a remarkable day. Unfortunately, this new home didn't work out, and Aurora would return to the Delta, this time Little Potato Slough in Stockton, where I would next see her again. In May of 2013, Chris Willson greeted me and took me for my third and final skiff ride around the still sparkling Aurora. But let's take a quick break and go aboard and have a top-to-bottom tour of this fascinating little ship with footage I took during her final years. The views of and beyond the bow from the flying bridge were wonderful. During the ship's cruising days, it must have been a favorite place for both officers and guests, and very windy too. That open grill in her funnel was designed for air to come in and push the exhaust upwards over her decks. It's the little things like the flare in the bulwarks that made the ship so unique. On bridge deck, there was that open forward terrace and open wings that must have been really chilly during her initial North Sea crossings. The original German engine telegraphs thankfully remained on Aurora's bridge wings, although the internal equipment was all auctioned off in Seattle in 1977. The wheelhouse still had its large console, although the telegraphs and navigation equipment were long since stripped out. This part of the ship, including the radio and chart rooms and the captain's quarters, which were just aft, were awaiting future restoration. Aft of the funnel, there was a skylight overlooking the engine room, and beyond the air vents at the far aft end of bridge deck, there was a small platform that overlooked the stern. I also want to emphasize that I took this footage during different visits over the years, so some of the areas shown, like the aft decks, were eventually restored. For the rest of this tour, I'll be using a Xanadu deck plan, since that was the ship's last active incarnation. I always loved that wide open terrace fronting promenade deck, and only wish I documented it more. That rounded cambered superstructure just looked beautiful from there. During the Aurora's final years, the promenade deck lounge was mostly used as a storage space, but it had great bones and much potential. And when the Xanadu partition and the wall coverings were removed, some of that original WAPPEN von Hamburg carved geese panel remained, along with the original linoleum decking. Directly aft, the forward promenade deck foyer also had a lovely shape and would have also been stunning when restored. Captured in the early Aurora days, those white benches actually date from the Polar Star era. Chris did a lot of restoration work on these promenades and the aft deck, removing the rotted woodwork and patching holes in the steel decking. One of the ship's key focal points, that gorgeous aft promenade deck foyer received a lot of attention in the Aurora's latter days. In this view, the letters that spelled out the ship's name were just being added. And here's the aft promenade after the rotted woodwork was removed and the steel was restored. When I filmed this in 2016, the historic tug Mazepeta had been tied alongside Aurora's port stern. This view from prom deck over the A-deck fantail was before it received a lot of TLC from Chris. Had Aurora's full restoration continued as planned, that gutted space on forward A-deck would have been transformed into a theater and exhibit room. A-deck began with Aurora's graciously long and sheared forecastle, where you actually walked uphill a bit as you reached the tip of her bow. This is where Nomikos Lines added that tiny pool in the ship's forward hold, which Chris had just started to restore during my last visit in 2018. That gutted forward space, originally a lounge and later staterooms, was used both for storage and as a workshop in the ship's latter years. For such a small ship, Aurora had quite a spectacular space in the double-deck reception lobby. Since this is where passengers entered the ship, it made a grand first impression. I've often wondered what became of the Poseidon and ancient China murals from the DELOS and Xanadu eras. I'm pretty sure Chris had plans to replace the missing murals with something special at some point. From here, alleyways on either side led past some of the ship's best staterooms to the main lounge. It's funny, but during the Aurora's latter years, I only got to document a few of these cabins in various phases of repair. I always figured I could come back and complete the job, but that never happened. So lesson learned for all classic ship fans, never put off until tomorrow what you can do today. Another rather epic space for such a small ship. The aft stairs and vestibules were the height of post-deco, early modernism style, with their gracious curves leading from prom deck to the dining room entrance on B deck.
This is a Canadian lounge. Probably gonna like better.
I'm honored, thank you.
The former ballroom and later lounge on A deck was looking wonderful with its restored functioning bar, and later on some cruise ship furnishings I donated to the Aurora. For a while, Chris and Jen honored me by naming it the Conejo Lounge. And just a bit farther aft, A deck ended with the mooring gear on the fantail. B deck began with crew and passenger cabins, leading to the lower level of the reception, where Chris would do some nice restoration and even add some furniture I donated from the Love Boat Island Princess a year or so after I filmed this. The reception desk, shown here during the DELOS era, had long since vanished. Cabins, some with portholes and others with small windows, continued aft of the reception lobby. At various times, some were in the process of being restored. Even in the dim light, you could still appreciate all those architectural nuances in the aft B-deck stairs. They just don't build them like this anymore. At some point during the X-Pex or Faithful era, they built a staircase in the middle of the dining room down to C deck. Chris eventually filled it in, opening up the space to the way it was originally. Some of the old ship furnishings I donated were integrated into this space as well. B-deck concluded with the galley on the port side and a food store space on the starboard side. C-deck had accommodations forward and aft to the machinery space. In the latter years, I never got back down there, but I did get to visit the engine room. In the control room, the panel itself looked surprisingly intact, especially since it had been decades since it was last used. And the workshop was just a few steps away. Here there are two of the 5 1200 brake horsepower Maybach diesels, which were reputedly among the last of their kind. And here are two more. From what I understand, they needed some work, but were still able to operate.
Less than 20 years ago, but it's like...
These are either the port or starboard drive generators.
Yeah, it's going to happen. I mean, this boat is always going to be...
This is definitely a space I wish I spent some more time in, but I'm really glad I at least have seen it. We'll conclude the official tour as low and far aft as possible in one of the shaft compartments. And now let's continue with the skiff encircling Aurora in her final home, Stockton's Little Potato Slough. Even with the Canadian minesweeper Chaleur on her port side, her lines were still magnificent. The 1957-built Chaleur was supposed to be there just for a week and then transferred to a scrapyard, but got tangled up in legal red tape and sank at her moorings in 2021. It would be 3 years before I returned to the Aurora, and to my surprise, she had been joined by 2 more ships. The Fur, a beautiful lighthouse tender built in 1939, and the tug Robert Gray, which towed her to San Francisco in 2010. Both ships were owned by the late Kurt Lind, who towed the would-be Xanadu II away from Alameda, and who sold her to Chris Willson. All of these were beautiful and historic ships in their own right, but having 4 ships clustered in that little inlet seemed like a potential red flag for unwanted local attention. When I returned in the fall of 2016, some of the furnishings I donated were being put to use, and the restoration efforts were continuing, albeit slowly.
I like the nice breeze blowing through here.
By that point, the adjacent Herman and Helen's marina had shut down, and more unwanted local attention was brewing around the Aurora and the other ships in Little Potato Slough. No less than 4 ships were still there in June of 2018 when I next returned, and Aurora had just been given a new coat of pale gray hull paint. The Aurora Restoration Project was starting to get an international following, and the latest project for their popular YouTube channel was the restoration of the pool on forward A deck. I had no idea at the time that this would be my final visit. In September of 2023, the 1942-built tug Mazepeta sank alongside the Aurora and had to be raised. With mounting pressure from local authorities to move the Aurora, Chris's dream project had now become a bridge too far. In October of 2023, Chris sold the Aurora, and by coincidence I found out while I was in the region being interviewed by filmmaker Robert James, who's making a full-length feature about Chris Willson and the Aurora.
And that didn't do so well. She was too small.
That happened to be in May of 2024, so I headed back to see the ship, and for the first time this one-time beacon of hope looked forlorn and once again in despair. She began to sink just a couple days later. Robert James and his team took this sad but spectacular drone footage on May 22nd. The poor old Aurora was in the news for all the wrong reasons. The Coast Guard and salvors were already in the process of raising the ship. Once secured, the city of Stockton proceeded with plans to dispose of the Aurora. On December 20th, the towing process had begun, and early on the morning of December 21st, Captain Corey Abelov photographed Aurora entering the dry dock at Lynn Marine on Mare Island. Captain Corey captured Aurora on a regular basis from the Vallejo ferry, and my friend Frank Cleope made weekly visits to Mare Island to document the sad process. By early January, as seen in this footage by Frank Cleope, Aurora had been sealed off for safe removal of asbestos and other toxins with a large containment vessel on her port side. By late January, in this footage by Corey Abelov, you can see there's another containment vessel that's been added on the aft promenade deck. In early February, Frank returned for a closer rain-soaked view. A few days later, you can hear the machines of destruction tearing out Aurora's innards as the process continues. As sad as it is, this step-by-step footage does show the careful process Lynn Marine employed in removing the toxic materials from the ship. In mid-February, Aurora was still sealed up, but by the 23rd, the containment vessels had been removed, along with most of her windows and portholes, revealing the 3 large holes that had been cut into her port side. On February 25th, a crane had been attached to her sleek foremast, and the following day it was gone, marking the first stage of her structural demolition. On March 4th, her hull still looked intact, but a few days later, her bow was missing. On March 10th, the cranes had chewed away most of her forward superstructure, and on the 11th they reached her bridge. By the 12th, the bridge was gone, and by the 13th, the destruction had reached her funnel. She was disappearing so quickly I had to make one final return to pay my respects and to capture what I could. It was as heartbreaking as it was fascinating to see such a process, and so ironic that as she reached the milestone of 70 years, this is what was in store. It was especially poignant to see her agony being dramatically floodlit that night. The following day, the full scenario unfolded before me. Aurora was half gone in what seemed to be a violent process by those metal-eating cranes. But that was much safer and more efficient than the cutting torch. As a ship lover, it felt post-apocalyptic to stand beneath her streamlined funnel as it dangled over so much empty space. The Maybach diesels had also been exposed, buried in a cascade of rubble. I laid my hand on a shard of her torn hull, as if to help soothe her pain. Yeah, I know that sounds ridiculous to most people, but this ship was once the pride of her nation and future owners, and brought happiness to many. Underneath that beautifully sculpted cruiser spoon's stern, I reached out once again to her bronze triple-bladed port screw. Now just a hunk of non-ferrous metal, it propelled the ship through so many wonderful vistas. She plied the waters of Germany, the Aegean, the Galapagos, the Caribbean, and of course Alaska. So many memories and life-changing experiences were made by and on board this little ship. There's no easy way out of this mortal coil, and that especially applies to ships. If they don't sink, they eventually get scrapped, and it's not dignified. That once beautiful vestibule on prom deck was all stripped out, and its grand staircase would vanish within days. And so, 49 years after my first visit, it was time for me to say a final goodbye. A few days later, the crane's harness had secured her funnel for safe removal, and by March 19th, it was gone. Those metal-eating cranes were now chewing away at her stern, eventually leaving just a sliver of her midship's hull and superstructure hovering over the basin. By April 1st, she was just a pile of chewed-up metal, and by April 9th, her demolition was complete. Her steel would be recycled at Sims Metal in nearby Richmond. And that concludes the 9th and final life of a special ship.